Can't do the worm.
Do the veggie one.
Not a worm though. You gotta get down the ground. If you choose this action, you'll be starting or renovating a worm farm to use and value your own renewable resources in the form of food waste. By the time you're done, you will be turning your food scraps into worm castings, which are solid and liquid gold for your veggie patch. So why bother with a worm farm and with processing your household waste? Because if you just throw away your food scraps into the bin, they'll create methane in your local landfill as they break down, a greenhouse gas that's contributing to climate change. Also, your food scraps are a marvellous and renewable resource and should be treated as such. By feeding your worm farm with your scraps, you're making free fertiliser for your garden, avoiding landfill, reducing household waste, reducing methane emissions, and valuing the resources you have around you. So, let's learn how to do it. The first thing you need to know about worm farms is that they don't need to be fancy to be efficient. You do not need to spend hundreds of dollars to create a functional, happy and healthy worm farm that eats all your kitchen scraps. There are some really good shop-bought worm farm designs, and we've linked to some of those below. However, if you don't want to spend a chunk of money to get your first worm farm started, you don't need to. In its essence, a worm farm is a container where compost worms eat your food scraps and then quickly create compost in the form of their poo or castings, which you then use as fertiliser, thereby converting your kitchen scraps into nutrient-dense, bioavailable plant food of the highest quality, with zero waste and zero emissions in the process. You don't need a big backyard to run a worm farm either. They can work really well on balconies or back steps, or even inside your home. Firstly, let's talk about the life forms doing all the work here, compost worms. The compost worm is a slightly different species to the normal earthworm that you'll find in your garden soil. These ones are sometimes called red wigglers or brandling worms or tiger worms. These worms eat organic material and the microorganisms that live amongst that material, and they eat a lot. Once your worm farm is working well, you can expect your worms to eat their own body weight in scraps every day. That means if you start your worm farm with 1 kilo of worms, soon they will be able to eat up to 1 kilo of scraps per day. That's a lot. This is seriously awesome food waste processing that we're talking here. Now, worm farms can come in all different shapes and sizes, but to succeed, they all have the features that these red worms need to thrive. Firstly, a worm farm needs good drainage. As the worms eat through your scraps, they produce castings, their poo, and also liquid, which needs to be able to drain off effectively so that the worms don't drown, and so that your worm farm doesn't go all stinky and anaerobic. Secondly, your worm farm will need a regular supply of carbon, things like leaves or shredded newspaper, as well as high nitrogen kitchen scraps. This is to ensure the worms have a balanced diet, and again, so your worm farm doesn't go all sludgy and stinky. About 50% carbon and 50% food scraps is a good balance to stick to. Thirdly, remember the worms, they have small mouths. This means that although they can eventually break down big chunks of scraps, like whole cabbage leaves, they much prefer smaller bits. This doesn't mean you need to dice all your food scraps into tiny squares, but it is something to keep in mind. If you're putting big bits of stuff in your worm farm, like this cabbage leaves, just chop them up a bit first. This only takes a second or two. It's an easy habit to form, and this way your worm farm will remain super happy. There's some things that red worms do not like to eat, so do avoid putting too much of these in your worm farm. Citrus is a big one. Skip the orange peels. Also, avoid adding alliums, things like garlic or onion ends. It's also best to avoid meat scraps, as the worms don't like them, but flies do, and a maggoty worm farm is no fun for anyone. Also avoid fats and oils, dairy products, and also spicy food. So just stick to your veggie scraps. A small amount of bread is okay, but not heaps. Veggie scraps are the go here. Now that said, don't worry if a tiny bit of this non-ideal stuff ends up in your worm farm. It's not going to immediately poison your worms, they just won't be so keen to eat it, which means that food may rot instead of being turned into castings. And too much rotten food in a worm farm will damage the worm colony's health because no one likes rotting things right next to their dinner. Neither do the worms. So stick to veggie scraps. Placement and temperature is the last big thing to consider for your worm farm. Ideally, keep your worm farm somewhere that it won't get too hot or too cold and that you visit every day. Worms like the same temperature range as humans, so they'll be most productive at about 15 to 30 degrees Celsius or 59 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that range, your worms will slow right down and eat much less food. And above that temperature range, they will abandon the top of your worm farm, where the food scraps are, for a cooler spot down the bottom, leaving your food scraps to rot a little bit. Somewhere close to the house that's out of direct sunlight is often ideal, or even inside your back porch. Keeping your worm farm cosy and also nearby ensures regular feeding and an even temperature, two things that will help your worm farm to thrive. Okay, let's look at starting a worm farm. You can use this method as well if you have an existing worm farm that's not doing so well. Let's take it apart and renovate it a bit. The most common type of worm farms that you will find or can make are a series of boxes stacked on top of one another that the worms can pass between. Start your first layer with a bedding of carbon. Shredded newspaper is good. Soak that in water, preferably unchlorinated water if you can, and make a layer about as deep as your finger. Now add a few vegetable scraps on top, not too much, just enough to cover the paper. And now add your worms. These might be in a packet from a gardening store or ordered online, or they might be from a friend who has a worm farm and has enough worms to share. Give the worms a few minutes to wriggle down and then put a wet Hessian sack or just an old t-shirt on top of them to keep them moist for this first phase. Then put your lid on and wait a few days for your worms to adapt to their new home before adding more food scraps. Each time you visit, peel back the Hessian cover and note whether the worms have processed the scraps from last time. If there's still heaps of uneaten scraps, wait a day or two before adding some more. Slowly, the worms will build up their abilities to chew through your food waste at an impressive rate. And once that first layer of the box tower is full, you can start adding a few more food scraps to the layer above. The worms will climb up there when they're hungry and ready for more food scraps. The idea with this type of worm farm system, and in fact all worm farms really, is that the worms will slowly continue to travel upwards in search of food, leaving behind trays and trays of rich worm castings, with the worm juice dripping out the bottom. As part of this process, they breed like crazy, making more worms and increasing the efficiency of your worm farm. And once you have a few trays of castings below your food scraps, you will be able to start harvesting these from the bottom of your worm farm to add to your garden or to swap with your neighbours for their gardens. There's a guide linked below for more details on this process. As said, there's all types of worm farms, but they all work along the same lines. One of our favourites and one of the most simple types is an in-garden worm tower, a simple vertical pipe with holes in the side that you sink into your garden bed and put a lid on top. Add some worms and periodically some kitchen scraps. The castings and juice will leach straight out into your garden bed. In 6 months, pull out the pipe and move it to another part of your garden and start again. You can also use a box for this system, and there's a how-to below. Finally, a word on using the worm castings. As said, these are super duper fertilizer for your plants, but they're very strong stuff, so don't use too much in any one place. We sprinkle the castings really lightly around the bases of plants throughout the growing season, right before we water those plants. Brassicas particularly love them. We also add worm castings to our seed raising mix. There's a link below for how to make that, because the castings provide a really rich fertilizer component for the growing seeds. It's fabulous stuff. With a little time and by taking things slow, you too can become a lifetime worm farmer. They're possibly the easiest pets you'll ever own, and they can create serious abundance for you while they're at it. This is using and valuing renewable resources and services, thanks worms, in the most basic and effective way possible, and it works. If you get into worm farming and love it, don't stop there. Your local school or community garden may welcome some help with their worm farming system too. These are skills to be shared, which have real-life outcomes for the fertility and abundance of your neighbourhood. So don't be shy, get out there and spread the wormy love. Good luck and let us know how you go.